3 of these splendid machines were now converted at Pocking, between Braunau and Passau, for our use. The place where Hitler sat was protected with armour plate, and the safety glass was of a thickness calculated to withstand bullets. From Hitler's seat to the cabin entrance was over 15 feet, which was much too far in an emergency, so a powerful hydraulic device was installed capable of opening a special trapdoor at his feet against the strongest air pressure, whilst a parachute was built into the seat in such a way that it could not be seen. All Hitler had to do in an emergency was to pull a red-handled lever situated at a convenient spot beside his seat. This operated the hydraulic mechanism and opened the trapdoor. Hitler could then escape by parachute. We tried this mechanism out repeatedly with a dummy of the correct weight and size, and it always worked satisfactorily. As soon as one of these machines was converted, I went down to Pocking to try it out for its flying qualities, and it came up to my highest expectations. It was equipped with an advanced type of WT apparatus which allowed more accurate beaming and position finding, and it had fully automatic 3-axis steering linked with the gyro compass. All these things are a matter of course nowadays, but then they were quite new. The day before I was to take over this machine and fly it to Berlin, there was a very heavy raid on Dessau, where the machine had been flown for its final check before handing over. I found a great part of the town devastated and a great deal of damage on the airfield itself. But our new Ju-290 was unscratched. By this time, the hopeless trek of hundreds of thousands from the outlying areas of Germany into the interior was reaching its height, and in Berlin there were large numbers of women and children from East Prussia who no longer knew what to do or where to go. Every time I flew down to Pocking in connection with the new Ju-290, I would load my plane with as many of these unfortunates as I could carry. When I returned from Russia after my long imprisonment, I was delighted to find that a good many of these people whom I had flown had settled down satisfactorily and made themselves new homes. Shortly before 09 Zers, on 17th of March, I touched down with my Ju-290 on Munich airfield. Almost every morning large formations of American bombers coming from Italy would pass over Munich on their way into Germany. I had already given orders for my plane to be rolled into a hangar, for were it left out, its unusual size might attract unwelcome attention from the passing enemy. Then I drove into town. I had not been gone more than 10 minutes when an air raid warning sounded. We drove out of town again as quickly as possible and stopped under trees in Leim to await developments. Before long, bombs began to fall to the east of Munich. The attacking bombers then turned away to the south, and I drove home. Before long, there was a telephone call for me. The airfield had been heavily attacked, the Ju-290 had been burnt out, and there were casualties. This time the Americans had done a good job. They had often attacked the airfield before, but usually their bombs had fallen harmlessly in nearby fields, only occasionally damaging a building. Previously, they had always flown from south to north, or from north to south on their way back, but this time they had flown from east to west, and it seemed to have improved their aiming, for the airfield and its installations were devastated. I rang up Berlin and ordered a machine to pick me up. When it arrived, I flew to Berlin, and that was the last I saw of Munich until 1955. In Berlin, I reported the fate of our Ju-290 to Hitler, but he took it very calmly, just nodding his head. In March, Giesler, Inspector General for the reconstruction of Munich, came to visit us in the damaged Reich Chancellery, and under the present circumstances we wondered what on earth there was to discuss about Munich's ultimate rebuilding. But Giesler saw nothing incongruous in his arrival, and informed us that his plans were now ready. For example, they provided for the rebuilding of the famous Frauenkirche with its double towers, which had always been Munich's distinctive architectural characteristic. Giesler was particularly delighted at the thought that this would please Cardinal Faulhaber. When Hitler heard what Giesler had come for, he positively beamed. We hadn't seen him look so cheerful for a long time, and the two of them went off by themselves to discuss the rebuilding of Munich. In the meantime, Berlin was being rapidly flattened. Hitler spent hours on the plans and made many sketches to show what he wanted. He seemed very happy, but for the rest of us, who knew that the final disaster was at the gates, it was an extraordinary and unreal experience. At the end of March, I went out to Schönwalde to inspect my machine park and visit my men. Whilst I was there, an air raid warning sounded, and the machines were put away as rapidly as possible in the hangars in the woods. But before all the planes could be got out of sight, a big formation of bombers flew over, accompanied by the usual strong fighter escort. 2 of the fighters spotted us and dived down. One of them shot up the 4-engined Condor of Grand Admiral Dönitz, which had 1,600 gallons of petrol in its tanks, and flared up tremendously, whilst the other attacked Ribbentrop's machine, a Ju .52. As the fighting came nearer and nearer to our airfield, I had to reckon that such losses would increase, so I had some of the machines, my spare engines and the greater part of my supplies and stores transferred to Pocking and Reichenhall. By April, the front was even nearer to Berlin. By this time, everyone knew that the situation was hopeless, and Berliners spent most of their time in cellars and air raid shelters. There were even rumours that Hitler was no longer in Berlin, but, in fact, he was still in the Reich Chancellery. On 1st April, the various ministries were instructed to leave the capital, and by 10th of April only the Foreign Office, part of the Propaganda Ministry, and Hitler's Reich Chancellery staff were left. Barriers were going up everywhere in the capital now, but they looked very sketchy, and not as though they had been planned in any detail. My machines were distributed amongst various airfields in the immediate neighbourhood: Rangsdorf, Finsterwalde, Gatow, Schönwalde and Tempelhof. Before long, Rangsdorf and Finsterwalde had to be evacuated. Colonel Böttger, the commandant of Tempelhof airfield, came to see me in Berlin. "Herr Bauer," he began, "I have done what I can to put Tempelhof in a state of defence, and we'll hold out as long as possible. But if the Russians take the place, I don't propose to let them take me." On 22nd April, the Russians took Tempelhof airfield and Colonel Böttger shot himself. Hitler had personally taken charge of the defence of the Reich Chancellery, and on 15th of April, it was a beautiful sunny day, he appeared in the garden to give various instructions. Mortar positions were being built, walls were being knocked down in order to obtain a free line of fire, anti-tank gun positions were being set up, and concrete defences with loopholes were being built. 1,000 men of his Leibstandarte under the command of General Mohnke were there to defend Hitler's last stronghold to the end. Frau Goebbels arrived in the Reich Chancellery on that day, and when Hitler saw her, he went up to her, exclaiming, "For heaven's sake, Frau Goebbels, what are you doing here in Berlin? You should have gone away long ago. Bauer here will fly you to the Berghof, whilst there's still time. You will be safe there with your children." "If the Russians take Berlin, my husband will be killed," she replied calmly. "And what point would there be then in our living on? I didn't bear my children for them to be put on show in the United States or Soviet Russia as the progeny of the Nazi propagandist Goebbels. No, I am going to stay here in Berlin with my husband." As she was obviously quite determined, Hitler arranged for her to live with her children in the bunkers, where Goebbels himself was now spending his nights. I was living in the Kanonierstrasse at the time, but when the house was bombed, I was given quarters in what had been the Yugoslav embassy. I was shaving one morning near the window when mortar shells fell. There had been no air raid warning, and there was no sign of any air activity, but about a couple of 100 yards away was a flak bunker, and the Russians were obviously getting the range. I happened to mention it to Hitler, and he was startled to find that I was still living outside the Reich Chancellery. He now ordered that I should be given quarters in it. Cubicles had been run up in the bunkers, and I was there now with Martin Bormann, Rattenhuber, Betz, and the detective Högel, who had been with Hitler at the time of the Röhm Putsch. He was now a high police official. The new Reich Chancellery looked pretty depressing. There was no longer any life above ground level. All the windows were gone, and the curtains, torn and dirty, waved wildly backwards and forwards in the constant blast. The Wilhelmplatz and the Vossstrasse were already in the firing line, But underground for 500 yards or so, there was a network of cellars and bunkers linked up with each other. It was possible for lorries to drive down from the surface into the bowels of the Reich Chancellery. At one time they had brought coke, now they brought wounded, when they came at all. During the last few days, about 600 wounded were brought in, and almost 1,000 civilians, mostly women and children, were allowed to take shelter after desperately running here and there on the streets trying to find a refuge. Hitler had his own bunker with just a few rooms for himself, his doctor, his servant, and the absolutely necessary personnel of his staff. This bunker was about 40 feet underground, though the entrance which led down to it from above was only about 3 feet or so below ground level. During the last days of the fighting, a shell penetrated the cover of this entrance corridor and burst inside. Light was supplied by a 60-kilowatt diesel engine, which also provided power for the water pump. Fire brigade hoses were laid through the underground corridors to serve as water pipes. In this way, Hitler's bunker and the general underground city of the Reich Chancellery, including the sick bay, had light and water right to the end, long after all outside sources had been cut off. On 17th of April, Goering arrived in the Reich Chancellery, accompanied by Major General Christian, who had been our Luftwaffe adjutant for a while. I asked him what Goering had come for, and he said it was to persuade Hitler to come to Obersalzberg, where Goering himself was going that evening by the Autobahn, which was still open but might not be much longer. Goering was with Hitler for about an hour and a half, and then the two of them appeared in the anteroom. They shook hands, and I heard Hitler say, "Mind you send reconnoitring parties on ahead. Fighting is taking place between Nuremberg and Bayreuth, and American tanks might break through. Good luck, anyway." The next day, Hitler told me that Goering had arrived safely. "At least someone I can trust can influence the development of affairs from outside," he said optimistically. The fighting increased in violence on 18 and 19th April. After a breakthrough from the Seelow Hills, the Russians launched a pincer drive to encircle Berlin, and after that, the battle for the centre of the town began to take shape. I was constantly on the airfield we were still using, and in the night planes were still taking off with documents and so on, for Munich. Part of the Reich Chancellery personnel was also flown out. Hitler's last birthday was a sad affair. Grand Admirals Raeder and Dönitz appeared with Himmler and Goebbels to congratulate the Führer. On 22nd April, by which time the Russians were already in the suburbs and pressing forward to the centre of the town, Hitler declared that he was determined not to leave Berlin. At the same time, he gave instructions that as many others as possible should be flown out. Every night after that, my machines carried people out to the south. The only airfield we had now was Gatow, and it was from here on 25 April that people and material were flown out to Munich and Salzburg for the last time. They would take off at 2 a.m. in order to be at their destination before dawn. The last machine to leave was piloted by Major Gundelfinger. Unfortunately, he could not get away on time because some of his passengers didn't arrive punctually. When he finally took off, we reckoned he would have nearly an hour's daylight flying before he reached his destination. All the other planes reported their safe arrival either during the night or in the early hours of the morning, but we heard nothing of Gundelfinger's plane. Hitler was very upset at this because one of his favorite personal servants was with this plane. And I entrusted him with extremely valuable documents which would show posterity the truth about my actions, he exclaimed in dismay. It was 8 years before it was discovered that Gundelfinger's plane had been shot down near the Bavarian forest, in daylight. The machine was burnt out. Peasants buried the bodies which were found in the wreckage. That same night, Professor Morel was also flown out, but in another plane. A couple of weeks before that, he had himself suffered a slight stroke and needed treatment. I was astonished at the extraordinary expression given to his face by the paralyzing of the muscles of the left side of the mouth and the eyelid. Powerful doses of his own medicine gave him temporary relief, but it was a warning signal. Morel wept when he left Hitler. He told me that Hitler had said that during the very short time that he, Hitler, still had to live, Dr. Stumpfegger would look after him. On 25th of April, Hitler received a telegram from Göring, who was in the Berghof. It said in Gist, "You have appointed me to be your successor. You are now cut off in Berlin and can no longer exercise your authority except within a very limited area. I therefore call upon you to transfer full powers to me." At first, Hitler did not take this telegram very seriously and merely commented that Göring probably had no idea of the situation in Berlin. We were still able to broadcast on long and medium wavelengths, but a shortwave broadcasting station had been overlooked, which meant that we needed an outside aerial. This was a great nuisance because the aerial was constantly being damaged by bombardment and we could not always repair it immediately. All incoming news was heard on ordinary receivers, and our signals section put together a daily bulletin for Hitler from the British and American broadcasts, which were already being issued in German. That same evening, a report came through that Göring had opened negotiations with the Americans. At this, Hitler became really angry and instructed Bormann to dispatch a message to Göring at once. Bormann showed me the message before it went off. Its gist was, "Your action represents high treason, which, in the ordinary way, would be punishable by death. Only your long and valuable services persuade me not to impose such a sentence. However, I order you to lay down all your offices and appointments within 24 hours." An answer arrived from Göring the very next morning. He came to heel and relinquished all his authority. Hitler then appointed General Ritter von Greim as Göring's successor and instructed him to fly into Berlin at once and report. As all our airfields were now lost, a runway for planes was established on the avenue from Brandenburger Tor to the Victory Column, and I was instructed to supervise the work. The Russians were bombarding this area very heavily because they knew that it was used by us for transport and communication, and on the way there a shell exploded a few yards away from our car. The chauffeur was wounded in the hand and the car was damaged, but I didn't get a scratch. Colonel Ehlers was waiting for me at the Victory Column to discuss the undertaking. The first thing I pointed out was that the avenue, though wide as such, was much too narrow for our purpose. It was about 70 yards across, whereas even a Ju-52 had a wingspan of 95 feet, which meant that even if it landed in the exact centre, there would be less than 60 feet to spare on either side. I therefore gave orders that the trees should be cut down on each side of the avenue in order to extend the width to 130 yards. Whilst I was standing there with Colonel Ehlers, we heard the engine of a Fieseler Storch and saw it touch down some distance away just before the Brandenburger Tor. I got into my car and drove to it at once to find out who had arrived, but when I got there, whoever it was had already gone. 2 soldiers told me that a wounded general and a woman had got out of the plane, taken a car and driven off at once. When I got back to the Reich Chancellery, I discovered that Hannah Reich was the woman pilot and that she had flown in with General Ritter von Greim. I knew the general well from the days of the First World War, and I found him now lying on an operating table. He had received a bullet in his calf on the way in. Hitler appeared too, welcomed von Greim, congratulated him on his successful flight into the beleaguered city, and wished him a speedy recovery. Von Greim stayed a couple of days, and I talked to him on several occasions. He told me that Hitler had given him a detailed description of what had happened during the past few days, and particularly the incident with Göring. Von Greim, it appeared, had also been appointed chief of the Luftwaffe and promoted to the rank of Field Marshal. In the night of 28th April, Hannah Reich flew him out of Berlin to take up his new command. On the 29th April, Hitler married Eva Braun. It was all done very quietly, and even I knew nothing about it until Hitler told me when he said goodbye to me. On the same day, several other marriages took place in the Reich Chancellery. Dr. Naumann performed the ceremonies, which took place above ground. There was a good deal of firing going on at the time, and the various couples were married to the accompaniment of breaking glass, falling masonry, and heavy explosions. They were then given separate rooms in the bunkers for a honeymoon perhaps unique in its tragedy, for not one of those pairs could hope for any happiness, or indeed for any future at all. That evening I spoke to Eva Braun, or Eva Hitler as she now was. She told me what, in fact, I already knew, that Himmler had also broken away. He was expelled from the National Socialist Party that evening. On 26th April he had tried to persuade Hitler to leave Berlin, sending a young officer with an armoured group, spearheaded by 6 Tiger tanks, into Berlin. On the way to the Reichschancellery they had shot up 9 Russian tanks. Beaming with delight at his success, the young officer saluted Hitler and delivered his message. Hitler received him very amiably, but repeated that it was his intention to stay in Berlin. The young officer was then seconded to General Weidling, the last commander of Berlin, and later on I met him again in Posen. SS group leader Fegelein, the liaison officer between Hitler and Himmler, was married to Eva Braun's sister, which now made him Hitler's brother-in-law. The day Hitler married Eva Braun, he summoned Fegelein, who couldn't be found. Then someone got the idea that he might be still in his own flat on the Kurfürstendamm. General Rattenhuber rang him up there. Incidentally, the Berlin telephone network worked right up to the last moment, and Fegelein answered the telephone. The general informed him that Hitler wanted to see him at once, and that everyone had been looking for him for hours. Fegelein replied that he was drunk and couldn't appear before Hitler in such a state. But Rattenhuber declared that orders were orders, and he would send along a car to fetch him. A car with several SS men set off, but they discovered that the area in which Fegelein's flat was situated was already in Russian hands. However, they fought their way through. One man was wounded and reached Fegelein's flat, where they found him tipsy, as he had said, and in civilian clothes. He was still unwilling to come, but promised that as soon as he sobered up, he would come. But he didn't, and after several more telephone calls, Fegelein was still in his flat. Another car was sent round at about 9 o'clock in the evening. This time an officer of the Wehrmacht and a number of soldiers went. Once again one of their number was wounded. This time Fegelein gave his word of honour that he would come later, and at about midnight he actually did come. When Hitler was informed that Fegelein had arrived at last, he said that he no longer wanted to see the man, and he ordered an investigation on a charge of desertion. At Hitler's instructions, General Mohnke, the commander of the Leibstlandale, deprived Fegelein of his rank insignia and his medals, and he was then lodged in the GPU bunker, which was below a church opposite the Hotel Kaiserhof. Eva Hitler now came to me in horror, declaring that Hitler would show no mercy. He would shoot his own brother in similar circumstances. It was her sister she was thinking of primarily, she declared, above all because she was about to have a baby. Early that morning, the results of the investigation were laid before Hitler. Fegelein had been found guilty of desertion. Hitler then ordered his immediate execution. An execution squad was sent off to carry out the sentence. Every attempt to move in the open was very dangerous by this time, but the men managed to reach their objective and Fegelein was executed in the garden of the Foreign Office. On 28th April, I had a talk with Frau Goebbels. We sat together calmly chatting, but I was very conscious all the time that I was talking to a woman who knew that she had only a very short time to live, and that as a mother she must first kill her children. "You know, Herr Bauer, life hasn't really given me very much," she said. "I bore children to my husband. I went to all the big meetings because he wanted me to, and I did my best to devote my life to him and my children. It wasn't always easy. My friends who envied me made me see a good deal. They would tell me about this or that, woman I ought to keep my eye on. I knew quite well, of course, that my husband, who was surrounded with attractive women, didn't take his obligation of marital fidelity very seriously. Perhaps it was the fault of the women. They certainly flung themselves at his head. He often hurt me, but I have forgiven him. I know that we shall never get out of this bunker alive. In any case, I have nothing more to hope for, and it isn't only just recently that I have felt that. Every evening I put the injections for my children ready, and when the time comes, the doctor will make them for me. The Russians are not more than a couple of 100 yards away now, and every night when I tuck my children in and say good night to them, I never know whether it's for the last time." As she spoke, her children were playing around us or talking to the wounded, to whom they sometimes sang little songs. When the bombardment occasionally reached new heights and the whole place shook, they would dance and clap their hands and wish the wobbling would go on. It was such fun. The last hope of the men fighting in Berlin was the almost legendary relief army of Generals Steiner and Wenck. On 29th April, Hitler called me and told me that he was sending Colonel von Below, who had been liaison officer between him and Goering, and was now his personal adjutant, with various instructions to General Wenck. Then he went on, "The way westwards is still open, and I want you to leave Berlin with Colonel von Below. I don't need you here any more." I replied firmly that I had already made my decision clear to him, and that my opinion had not changed in the meantime. "I am staying here," I said, "and I've no doubt I'll find various things to do. For example, I can take Colonel von Below's place when he's gone." There wasn't very much left for an adjutant to do, but Hitler agreed, so once again I had a job. Looking back on it now, it seems astonishing that there were people even then who still wanted to see Hitler. For example, the nurses, who had been working night and day for weeks in our underground hospital, asked that he should visit them. Professor Haase and Frau Goebbels went to Hitler and told him, and he agreed to do so. You had to go through a canteen before going down to the hospital below, and the nurses were gathered there with Frau Goebbels and her 4 children and about 20 other children. When Hitler came into the room, the children began to sing. With his hands in his jacket pockets, he walked past the nurses, nodding to them. Then he halted and stood there for about half a minute without saying anything. There was silence, and most of the nurses were in tears. Still without saying anything, Hitler turned and left the room, and the nurses went back to their patients. On 29th April 29th, the battle for the Reich Chancellery itself opened up. The following day I was repeatedly called into Hitler's bunker, for, after all, I was now his adjutant. The last time I was called in, I was told to bring my own adjutant, Colonel Betz, with me. Hitler's room was quite small, and the furniture consisted of a couch, a small sideboard, a table, and a few chairs. The concrete walls had been covered with wood panelling. As soon as I entered, Hitler came up to me and took both my hands in his. "Bah, I want to say goodbye to you." "You don't mean—" I began in dismay. "Yes," he answered. "The time has come. My generals have betrayed me. My soldiers don't want to go on, and I can't go on." I tried to persuade him that there were still planes available, and that I could get him away to Japan or the Argentine, or to one of the sheiks, who were all very friendly to him on account of his attitude to the Jews. Hitler made himself many enemies over the Jewish question, but he also won a number of friends. After the war, which of course he had expected to win, he proposed to take Madagascar away from the French and turn it into a national home for the Jews. It was to be a sovereign and independent state, and all Jews, including those living in Egypt, would be sent there. This plan naturally won him the sympathy of the Mufti, who was living in Egypt and had visited Hitler on a number of occasions in the Reich Chancellery. I had seen him there once or twice myself, and Hitler told me when he was gone that he was a very cunning fox indeed. Hitler declared once again that he would under no circumstances leave Germany. He could go into the mountains, of course, or he could go to Grand Admiral Dönitz in Flensburg. But what would be the good of that? In a couple of weeks at the outside he would be in the same situation as he was now. "The war will end with the fall of Berlin," he declared. "And I stand or fall with Berlin. A man must summon up courage enough to face the consequences, and therefore I'm ending it now. I know that tomorrow millions of people will curse me. That's fate. The Russians know perfectly well that I am here in this bunker, and I'm afraid they'll use gas shells. During the war we produced a gas which could put a man to sleep for 24 hours. Our intelligence tells me that the Russians now have this gas too. The consequences would be unimaginable if they captured me alive. There are gas locks here, I know, but can you rely on them? In any case, I'm not, and I'm ending it today." Hitler then thanked me for the many years' loyal service I had given him, and he looked round the room. "I want to give you something," he said. "What about this picture on the wall here? It's a Lenbach of Frederick the Great. I've owned many pictures in my life, some of them much more valuable than this one, which cost me 34,000 marks in 1934. I want it preserved for posterity. It has considerable historical value." I replied that I would gladly accept it, and that in more peaceful times I would present it to some art gallery. "No," he said, "that's not what I want at all. It's for you. It's enough if it's in your hands. I know you've often grumbled about my pictures, including this one, but that was another matter." I must have looked at him in astonishment, for he explained, "You remember that whenever I changed my headquarters for more than a day or so, this picture had to go along. They told me long ago about the way you used to grumble." And then I remembered that awkward item of baggage that was never allowed to be sent on with the baggage plane but always had to go in our machine, leaning in the gangway in everybody's way. I knew, of course, that Hitler was very fond of his pictures and liked to have them around him, so that when we went away from one place for long, his pictures had to go along too. I tried to excuse myself and explain that other people used to complain when they had to pass that large package in the gangway. But Hitler smiled and interrupted. "All right, Bauer, all right." And then he went on more seriously. "Now, I've still 2 jobs for you, Bauer. I am making you responsible for burning the bodies of my wife and me. And then I have appointed Dönitz my successor, and Bormann has important instructions from me to be communicated to Dönitz, and I want you to get him out of here. It is very important that Bormann should get to Dönitz." Hitler then shook hands firmly with me and turned to Colonel Betz, thanked him for his services and shook hands with him too. I had already turned to leave the room when Hitler walked after me and caught hold of me impulsively with both hands. "Bauer," he exclaimed, "on my tombstone they ought to put the words, 'He was the victim of his generals.'" When I made some comment, he went on, "Bauer, there's a good deal you don't know, and you'll find out some things that will astonish you." Later on, in prisoner of war camps, I was with generals who had been urging our men to throw down their arms and go over to the enemy since 1944, when they were taken prisoner, and I knew then what Hitler had meant. When we left Hitler, I said to Betz that we should have to try the breakout that very night, and that we needed different clothes, for we should have to make our way to the plains on foot. It was 19 Dar when we left Hitler, and not 16 Gar, as I have since seen it said. I went down to Professor Haas, who was operating day and night on the wounded and hardly ever got away from the operating table except to snatch a little sleep, and I asked him for a couple of camouflage capes and packs from the kit brought in with the wounded men. He found me the camouflage capes, but said that he hadn't any packs because the men were being brought in from positions close at hand and therefore had no packs with them. I then handed over all my spare personal clothing, shirts, socks and so on, for the wounded. I managed to get a pack from a Luftwaffe man, but it had no straps, so Bormann gave me some and I sewed them on myself. Then I burnt all my papers. About an hour and a half had passed, and to find out what had happened in the meantime, I went with Betz through the ruined corridor which led under the garden of the Reich Chancellery to the Führer's bunker. Even before I had gone down the 20 steps which led to it, I smelt cigarette smoke, which was unusual here because Hitler was a non-smoker and smoking was forbidden anywhere near his quarters. I went quickly down the steps, and there I found Goebbels, Rattenhuber, Müller and Bormann, with perhaps a dozen SS men, all very obviously on edge. I asked Goebbels if it were all over, and he nodded. I then asked if Hitler's body was still in his bunker, whereupon Goebbels replied that it was already being burnt. When I told him in surprise that Hitler had made me responsible for burning his body, he replied that Hitler had given everybody those instructions when he said goodbye. Hitler committed suicide shortly after I left him, he added. I asked whether he had shot himself. Yes, in the temple. He was lying on the floor. Eva Braun took poison, and she was sitting on the sofa as though she were asleep. It appeared that Hitler's body had been wrapped in blankets and carried upstairs into the open. Hitler's chauffeur, Kempke, had brought along tins of petrol. Goebbels, Bormann, Rattenhuber and Müller had been present at the burning of the body. Rattenhuber told me that during the burning Eva Braun's body had twitched violently, and it is, in fact, well known that this phenomenon is common. Hitler's body had shrunk in on itself. With this I regarded the matter as ended, and I didn't even go up and look, an omission I was to have cause to regret later on in Russia, because investigations showed that the cremation of the bodies had not been complete, and that certain parts, though charred, had not been destroyed. When I was ready to go, I reported to Martin Bormann, who told me that it depended on General Rauch, who was now in command of the defence of Charlottenburg, whether we made the attempt today or tomorrow. Rauch would be arriving at the Reich Chancellery at 22 Kauf. Bormann also said that there was a suggestion that surrender negotiations might be opened up, because it was now well established that the Russians were raping every woman they got hold of, irrespective of age. For example, all the nurses and even bedridden patients at the Weissensee hospital had been raped. When our nurses heard this, and some of them were very pretty and attractive girls, they all began to clamour for poison to do away with themselves, rather than fall into Russian hands. There were also quite a large number of women in the bunkers, and they were all obviously threatened with the same fate. Goebbels had been asked to hand over the Reich Chancellery officially to the Russians, in order, if possible, to prevent the sort of thing that had happened at Weissensee. General Krebs, who spoke Russian, was to go to Marshal Zhukov to open up negotiations and see if reasonable conditions could be obtained. After that, I went to Linge, who was Hitler's valet, to get my Lenbach portrait of Frederick the Great. We took it out of its frame and rolled it up. The actual size of the canvas was about 24 by 16 inches, and tied it on top of my pack. It was 22 hours now, and General Rauch arrived. Through Bormann, I learned what Rauch had to tell us. The Russians were already in Grunewald and Spandau, but the Heeresstrasse was still open, and the bridge over the Havel was being successfully defended by Hitler youth detachments under Axmann. There was, therefore, no urgent reason why our departure should take place at once. Frau Goebbels, Rattenhuber and I were together that evening, and our conversation was not very cheerful. At 03:00 hours, a policeman arrived and reported to Rattenhuber that the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun had been consumed, apart from negligible remains, and buried in shell holes. The garden and forecourt of the Reich Chancellery was pitted with shell holes. I learned only later in Moscow that this report was inaccurate. Ambassador Hewell, who had been liaison officer between Hitler and Ribbentrop, sat at a little distance from us, looking at a photograph of his young wife. They had been married only a few months. I asked him whether he was going with us. There were tears in his eyes when he replied, "I don't know, Bar. I really can't give myself up to the Russians." I pointed out that none of us intended to give ourselves up to the Russians. "It doesn't look very hopeful," I admitted, "but we might manage it. You never know." "Right," he said with determination. "I'll come along. And if it looks as though they're going to take me, I can always shoot myself. I don't want to become a traitor to Hitler, though I often disagreed with his policy." When we started out the next day, Hewell could see that the situation was hopeless, and he blew his brains out before the Russians got him. A little later that evening, General Bergdorf asked me to shoot him, but I refused, and then he shot himself. General Krebs shot himself, and so did Schädler, who was wounded in the leg and therefore couldn't come with us. General Müller, the chief of the Gestapo, also decided not to come with us. "I know Russian methods too well to take the risk of falling into their hands, Bauer," he said. "They'd shoot me in any case, but at least I can save myself the preliminary beatings and the torture." A wave of suicides now swept through the bunkers, for many highly placed people preferred a quick death at their own hands to imprisonment by the Russians. I often thought about them later on when I was in Russian hands and subjected to endless ill treatment, and I once told a Russian commissar that I envied my comrades who had decided to end it with a quick shot. They were better off than I was. At dawn the following day, General Rauch set off to return to his men, but at midday he was back in the Reich Chancellery in a very downcast mood. He had been unable to get farther than the zoo bunker, for during the night the Russians had driven a wedge through the Tiergarten, and we were now completely surrounded. The reports on the situation reaching the Reich Chancellery were very confused, and it was difficult to get a clear picture. But General Weidling decided that as the westward escape route seemed closed, we should try to make our way out northwards over the Weidendam Bridge, where the first Russian lines were situated. The second line was in Oranienburg, but to the north of that was an SS division under Steiner. If we could get through to them, we should be safe, for the moment at least. Orders were now given that the breakout should start at 21:30 hours that evening. Shortly before we left, I went down to Dr. Goebbels to say goodbye. He was in his bunker room with his wife. I didn't see the children and I didn't ask about them, so I don't know whether they were already dead then or not. When I went in, they both got up and there were tears in their eyes. "Berlin is completely surrounded now, Bauer," Goebbels said, "and it won't be easy for you to get out, but I wish you luck. Do your best. Bormann has important instructions for Dönitz. If you manage to get through, tell Dönitz what the situation's been like here this past 3 weeks. And tell him that we knew how to live and fight and then how to die." I shook hands silently with them both, and then I left. Just before 21:30 hours, we were ordered to go forward in small groups. I kept with Bormann, as I had been instructed to do. There were about 15 of us in our group, and we went out of the Vossstrasse entrance, where the SA sentries had always stood, and from there we ran towards the Kaiserhof underground station. It had been badly damaged, and there were no steps left, so we went down into the station on our behinds. Apart from where bombs and shells had broken open the tunnel, it was quite dark. We had no torches, and we went forward in the dark over the Friedrichstrasse crossing and on to Gendarmenmarkt, where we came out again and found everything in flames. We now went back to the Friedrichstrasse, and from there towards Weidendam Bridge. A little way before this there was an anti-tank barrier, and about 100 yards further on, burning lorries in front of the Russian lines. The Russians knew that anyone attempting to get out of Berlin to the north would have to pass over this bridge, and so they put up a concentrated barrage, with the result that casualties in this area were very heavy. Martin Bormann crouched on the stone steps of a house doorway on the corner of Schiffbauerdam. A young Russian lay dead just in front of him. I was still trying to find a way forward. From the Friedrichstrasse, we were to make our way into the Ziegelstrasse, and from there into a big brewery, which was our meeting point. But every time I tried to go forward, I had to turn back. "Stay where you are, Bauer," Bormann called out. "I don't want you shot. You can see for yourself how many wounded are streaming back. I need you. Stay with me." I told him that it was impossible to stay put. We must try to get forward. The night was short enough as it was, and we had a long way to go. Then I went forward again to a ruined house. It had once been a hotel, and beyond it we could almost reach the corner of the Siegelstrasse. It was about 2 o'clock when Bormann and I ran forward. The Russians were firing persistently from the direction of the Chausseestrasse as we sprang and clambered over heaps of rubble to get to the ruined hotel. We took refuge in a doorway and discovered that the hall behind it and the cellar below was full of people, most of them wounded. Their position seemed pretty hopeless, but there was nothing we could do about it, and I went out onto the street to see if there were a possibility of going on. German and Russian tanks were fighting it out in the streets. Several giant Russian tanks were destroyed by anti-tank weapons, and I was standing quite close to a German tank when it suddenly opened fire, and I was thrown to the ground by the blast. Afterwards, I discovered that my face had been so seared by the explosion that it took me months to get the little black powder spots out of my skin. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the doorway. Then I heard the sound of shooting from the courtyard at the back, and I ran up the stairs to look down. In the flicker of burning cars, I saw about a score of Russians down below. As quickly as I could, I ran back to Bormann and told him that all the Russians had to do to finish us off was to open the back door, and it was therefore time we moved. It was time anyway, for there was only about an hour's darkness left. There were only 4 of us left now: Bormann, Naumann, Dr. Stumpfegger and myself, and we all knew that once it was light there would be no chance at all of getting out of the trap. There was, we had heard, a possibility of getting out of inner Berlin underground. Youths and girls, who knew their way around through the cellars and the passageways that had been knocked between them for air raid purposes, had taken out many soldiers under the Russian lines. In fact, you could go for hundreds of yards under great blocks of buildings, though, of course, during the bombardment and the fighting, it often happened that the way was blocked by fallen debris. But we came across no one who could have guided us through the underground labyrinth, and we had no torches with which we might have found our own way, so, for better or for worse, we had to chance our luck above ground. We had very little time left now, and after a short discussion we decided to make a final, desperate attempt. Dr. Naumann of the Propaganda Ministry went first, followed by Martin Bormann, then came Dr. Stumpfegger, and I brought up the rear. But we had hardly put our noses outside the house doorway in which we had been sheltering than the shooting started up again. We got to the Siegelstrasse and ran along it in Indian file. The shooting seemed to be coming from everywhere: windows, doors and corners. Cars were burning, and the wounded were groaning. Shortly before the university clinic, I threw myself to the ground. When the shooting died down, I looked up again, and there was no one to be seen. They were not troubling to pursue anyone. They merely fired on anything that moved. To this day I have never heard any more of Bormann and Dr. Stumpfegger, but I feel sure that they were both killed. Bormann was wearing a simple brown uniform with no special distinguishing marks, and in all probability his dead body was picked up together with the thousands of others that lay around in the streets at the time, and buried as the body of an unknown man in one of the mass graves. No doubt the Russians carefully examined all the dead bodies they picked up in the neighbourhood of the Reich Chancellery, but Bormann was killed some distance away, and in any case his features were not so well known as those of many of the others. Naumann did survive, as I discovered later. It was daylight when I ran back in the other direction. Others were running now, and I ran with them. We went along the Spree Canal as far as the bridge leading down to the Wilhelmstrasse, and there well-aimed fire made us turn back. Then we went along the Stadtbahn towards Lehrte station, but again we were turned back by heavy fire, this time from the direction of the Reichstag. Then we tried again in the protection of the railway embankment, aiming to get past Charité Hospital, but the Russians were already in occupation, and there were many casualties. Quite close to Lehrte station, we raced through a courtyard right into the line of fire of Russian Tommy gunners. I felt a violent blow in the legs, and I fell down. The first searing pain probably made me cry out, and men grabbed me and dragged me into a house that was already burning and had lost the greater part of its facade. Good Samaritans splinted one leg with pieces of wood and cardboard and bandaged the other leg, which had got a bullet clean through it without touching the bone. In the first excitement, I didn't even notice that I had also been hit in the hand and chest. The fire was spreading now, and I could feel the ground under me getting hotter and hotter. By my side lay a pistol with which I intended to blow my brains out rather than be burnt alive. The house was still under fire, and bullets were ricocheting wildly off the walls. Somewhere quite close wounded were crying out. After about 4 hours of this, a Russian arrived with 3 German prisoners to collect the wounded. It was from this Russian that I first heard the words that were to become so familiar to everyone at the time. Yuri, Yuri, from the German word Uhr, watch, wristwatch in this case. My watch, an airman's job with every possible device, pleased my captor tremendously. He seemed to have been doing well, for he already had about a dozen wristwatches, but mine was the best of them all, and he was delighted, for he kept repeating, "Korosho, korosho." Good, good. In the cellar in which I was lying, there was a bedstead, and this was taken to pieces to form a stretcher for me. I was laid on this and carried out into the Invalidenstrasse,